Ukraine versus Russia is essentially David versus Goliath. Look at any parameter, there is no comparison.
By land, sea and air, President Putin has a vice around Ukraine.
The Ukrainians may not have the air power, but they have the will, the determination, and the heart, and they have inflicted huge damages on the Russian soldiers.
Well, no one doubts Ukraine's determination to resist Russia's attack. Their bravery in the face of overwhelming firepower is clear. But the weapons, well, that's another story and the focus of today's program. Ukraine's military is far smaller than Russia's, and President Volodymyr Zelensky is imploring the West to give him more military hardware to even things out. But the West is treading a fine line. Its leaders have said they don't want to risk starting World War III. And so they've supplied Ukraine with substantial amounts of defensive weapons, but there'll be no fighter jets or attack helicopters. So for now, Ukraine will have to manage with what it has, plus the defensive weapons from the West. And it's still a very asymmetrical picture. After the United States, Russia is considered to have the most powerful military in the world, although China is catching up fast. Russia certainly outguns Ukraine's military, which is ranked 22nd, just ahead of Canada. Both Russia and Ukraine spend a little more than 4% of GDP every year on their militaries. But because Russia's economy is 10 times bigger, its military spending is also 10 times bigger. $66 billion a year versus just $6 billion a year. And so Russia can afford far more personnel and weapons. Here are the key numbers recorded before the attack began nearly 2 months ago. Russia has more than 4 times the number of active personnel, 850,000 compared to 200,000. Nearly 5 times the number of combat tanks, over 12,000 compared to 2,500. About 2.5 times the number of armored vehicles, over 30,000 versus just over 12,000 in Ukraine. And nearly 7 times the number of rocket projectors, more than 3,000 compared to Ukraine's 490. In the air, the differences are even greater. Russia's Air Force has 13 times the number of military aircraft, over 4,000 compared to just over 300. For example, Russia has over 10 times the number of fighter jets, 772, compared to Ukraine with just 69, and nearly 20 times the number of attack helicopters, 649 versus 34. At sea, it's a similar story. Russia's total fleet is more than 600 strong. Ukraine has less than 40 vessels. And Russia is one of only 10 countries in the whole world to have an aircraft carrier, whereas Ukraine, like most other nations, doesn't have one. It also has no destroyers, whereas Russia has 15, and no submarines, Russia 17. At sea, in the sky, and on the ground, it's clear that on paper, Ukraine's military is no match for Russia's, and so the West has been trying to quickly close the gap. So far, more than 30 countries have sent military aid to Ukraine. The United States has sent thousands of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, as well as helicopters, patrol boats, vehicles, guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The UK has also sent thousands of anti-tank missiles, as well as armoured vehicles and an air defence system. Germany has hastily rewritten its policy that barred the export of weapons to war zones and has also sent anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, as well as machine guns and night vision gear. Ukraine's government is no doubt grateful for all this support, but some Ukrainian politicians argue it's the least the West can do, having persuaded Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal in the 1990s in exchange for promises from the West and Russia to respect its sovereignty. If they still had nuclear weapons, they say, Russia would never have dared to attack. Okay, let's bring in our guest now. Liam Collins is a retired US Army colonel who advised the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense from 2016 to 2018 and is now teaching at the prestigious West Point Military Academy. James Maclaren is a former commanding officer in the British Army. He's now a journalist and military analyst. Vincent Castillo is an assistant professor of logistics at The Ohio State University. He's also an Army veteran who trained for a short period in Ukraine in 2010. And Justin Bronk is a senior research fellow at RUSI, a British defense and security think tank. Welcome to all of you. Liam Collins, I'd like to start with you. Can we start with the big picture? By most accounts, Russia is failing to meet its military objectives in Ukraine. Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that is?
Russia's clearly not achieving its strategic objective, which was the overthrow of the Zelensky regime and installing a Russian favorable government. And the reason for this is warfighting is a function of many things beyond the combat weapon systems and the size of the military, right? Strategy, doctrine, operational employment, leadership, culture, the will to fight. And the only category where Russia has the edge is in overwhelming combat power. But in every other category, Ukraine has the edge, and that's why they've been successful to date.
James Maclaren, let's focus on the weapons, as that's what predominantly this program is about. Which weapons have proven to be the most effective in defending Ukraine, and where did those weapons come from?
Well, I'm afraid it's a slightly more complicated question to answer than you might think. It goes back to Liam's point about the different strategic context of the two protagonists. Ukraine is in a war of national survival and it's defending its territory, and therefore it's relying very much on close combat weapons, which can blunt the major Russian threat at the moment, which is its armor and its air and its artillery. And in that context, it's been very successful in blunting Russian armored advances with anti-armor ambushes, using things such as the Javelin weapon system from the United States, NLAW from the UK, and the 2B2 drones from Turkey. These weapon systems have been very good in close combat situations and have definitely had a large impact in writing down Russian armor.
We've heard that, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense anyway, says that Russia's lost 680 tanks. Oryx, a military blog, says it's more like 460. Either way, the Russians have lost hundreds of tanks. So do you put that down to the Javelins from the United States and the NLAWs from the UK and the Switchblade?
To a point, but again, I go back to what Liam says. Combat power has three major elements: the moral, the physical, and the conceptual. And whilst Russia certainly has the overwhelming advantage in the physical means of fighting, the tanks, the artillery, it lacks the ability to mobilize its forces in the moral and the conceptual sphere. Ukraine has no such constraints about that. It's had over 2 decades to prepare for this conflict. They've known it's probably been coming for some time. And so they've made their plans well. And given the right tools, the NLAWs, the Javelins, the 2B2s, then they have the means to inflict severe damage on the Russians, but probably not stop them.
Germany's foreign minister says Ukraine needs heavy weapons, and she appears ready to supply them, but the chancellor is more reluctant or cautious. When she says heavy weapons, what is she referring to?
Well, what I take it to mean is those weapons that would be used to turn the conflict into that of offensive counter moves by the Ukrainian forces. And we are talking about their own main battle tanks, supported by artillery, probably self-propelled, and also infantry to protect them, as well as engineers to give them mobility across terrain that they've lost. The problem with all of that, of course, is it requires a much higher level of capability and competence amongst the Ukrainian armed forces, and that takes time to build that capability. It's first world stuff, and it isn't there at the moment, and it will take some time. Right. And above all of that, you have to apply the layers of command and control, surveillance capability, intelligence, strategic intelligence, and strategic enablers. So it's a big task to turn that. It's not just a question of handing over large pieces of military equipment.
Right. Justin Bronk, the West, we've heard Biden and others say it, we've got to be careful with the types of weapons we supply, especially offensive weapons. We risk starting a world war with Russia. Where would you draw the red lines over what types of equipment?
So I think the massacres in Bucha, the forced deportations in Mariupol, and the blatant, deliberate targeting of civilian-held areas with all sorts of munitions have pretty quickly eroded the hesitancy among most Western countries about which categories of weapons they supply to Ukraine. The concern is more about what sort of weapons they can, particularly heavy weapon systems, they can support and maintain, or can build the capacity to support and maintain. So, for example, Western fighter aircraft or tanks, yes, you could train the crews to operate them, Ukrainian crews to operate them in a matter of a few weeks to a few months, depending on what sort of system you're talking about. But it takes far, far longer to train crews to maintain and service those vehicles and to build up a logistics system. So that's kind of where the decision points are around what type of weapon systems are specifically supplied to Ukraine. The key around escalation management at this stage is ensuring that we don't cross any lines that would potentially risk direct conflict between Western military assets and Russian military assets, hence the refusals to, for example, try and implement no-fly zones or any sort of contractor-based support, for example, in Ukraine itself for, say, new weapon systems, which could lead to, let's say, US or UK or other allied personnel being killed directly by Russians in Ukraine. So that's where the kind of key escalation dynamic is.
Just to be clear then, you're saying that the only limitations to the types of weapons that the West is willing to provide are the ones, the limitation being, can they be trained and can they be supported to use them effectively?
Within the boundaries of what Ukraine is asking for. So, of course, there are limitations. I mean, nobody's going to supply nuclear submarines, let's say, to Ukraine, partly because they don't need them. But also, of course, that would be a different sort of discussion. But given what Ukraine is asking for, which is tanks, fighter aircraft, artillery, large shipments of ammunition to continue, those things, the questions are around whether we can provide things that the Ukrainians can viably support and use, not whether those are considered escalatory at this stage. I think Russia's actions have taken us far beyond those considerations at this stage in terms of what we supply.
Okay, can we look at those actions just briefly? There have been reports that Russia may have used chemical weapons in Mariupol. Do you find those reports credible? And why would such weapons be used when they have plenty of other choices?
So it's theoretically credible in the sense that that there's been considerable intelligence about Russian forces potentially preparing the ground to use chemical weapons in some sort of provocation. On the other hand, the reports, it's almost impossible to diagnose remotely chemical weapons attack symptoms unless there are very specific symptoms that are associated with particular weapons, and that is not what we've seen in Mariupol. We've seen shortness of breath. We've seen difficulty walking, difficulty breathing among a relatively small number of troops. And that none of the symptoms reported sound like some of the wilder accusations about, say, sarin or nerve agents like that. And it's worth remembering the fighting in Mariupol is going on in primarily industrial areas now, and large sections that are on fire and are being shelled. So it would be slightly odd, given that such a large part of an industrial area is on fire, if some pretty unpleasant things weren't on fire, which would cause respiratory problems. And add to that, of course, the use of thermite or phosphorus munitions for both marking and potentially deliberate targeting, both of which can produce fumes which are not chemical weapons, but are very unpleasant if you breathe them in a confined space. So I think it's unlikely that it's actually a chemical weapon system that's been used in Mariupol. Understood. But we must keep an open mind and investigate.
Vincent Castillo, you handled logistics for the US Army. You're now a professor of logistics. How much of Russia's problems are down to logistics? We've seen, for example, tanks being towed off by farmers and so on because they've run out of fuel. I don't know if that's propaganda or not, but the suggestion is that Russia can't handle this.
Sure. Well, one of the key tenets of planning offensive operations is to not outpace your sustainability or your supply chains, your logistics capabilities. And Justin alluded to this, but with Russia trying to move so quickly and in attempting to try to move Russia had this idea that they would have this conflict over in a matter of days. It appears that they didn't plan the sustainability component of their invasion, and they were as a result they outpaced the ability to resupply some of their attacking units like tanks and be able to provide them with the additional fuel that they need to continue moving forward. And it resulted in tanks being abandoned on the battlefield, getting stuck, not being able to be recovered. And it led to what we've seen videos of on social media, Ukrainian farmers hauling away these abandoned vehicles using their farming equipment.
Just staying on that same point of logistics, but the other side of things, there have been some reports that, because America has given 50 million rounds of ammunition and thousands of javelins and so on, they even may struggle to keep the supply coming. Is that Is that possible?
It comes down to trying to determine exactly how much is needed and where. Every time that we see Ukrainian politicians on TV, they're calling for more and more equipment and more support. This is what they're supposed to be calling for every time they get the opportunity to. So the NATO countries, and including the U.S., are attempting to provide the support that Ukraine is asking for to aid them in the defense of their country. But the challenge is to be able to get the right quantity of ammunition or whatever the equipment may be in the right place at the right time and in the right condition to the people who can actually use that equipment.
Liam Collins, we heard in an early report that, of course, Ukrainian politicians have shown their gratitude towards the West for these military supplies, but one or two politicians in Ukraine have come out and said, well, if we hadn't given up our nuclear weapons back in the 1990s under the Budapest Memorandum, Putin would never have dared to attack us. Of course, there have been other reports saying, well, it doesn't quite make sense because the codes were held in Russia and so on. Could you tell us, could you explain, first of all, if that is a relevant sort of claim by the Ukrainian politicians that Putin would not have attacked had they retained those nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think without a doubt. I mean, if you look, nations don't wage wars and invade other nations with nuclear weapons. It's the best deterrent that there is. So that's true. But if you go back, I mean, Ukraine couldn't afford keeping the nukes at the time. They were very expensive to maintain. And there's a lot of reasons why it would have been hard for Ukraine to keep those nuclear weapons. So while true, it's irrelevant to the conversation at hand because they do not have them. And so they're fighting the war with what they have right now. And that's what they need is arms, ammunition, or as their Minister of Defense said a few days ago, I need three things: weapons, weapons, and more weapons.
James, same question to you about the nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with members of the Ukrainian General Staff in 1998, and they were quite clear then that they would have no choice but to give up the nuclear arsenal they've got. The codes is a bit of a red herring because a lot of them were tactical nuclear weapons, which under the old Soviet doctrine was actually delegated to quite a low level anyway. There weren't the political control over nuclear weapons, certainly in Cold Front days, that there are now. But I agree with Liam. They had no choice. It was quite right that they gave them up. They gave it up in response to economic aid and security guarantees. But they are not a factor now. And they have to fight with what they've got. As for whether it's weapons, and weapons, that's fine. It's a little glib. Of course, you also need a means of distributing those weapons, which is not going well. They are still they're working on short lines of supply to the Ukrainians. Lines of communication, but they will get better and they will get there. And going back to the Russian part, I mean, I think one of the things we've got to recognize is that the days of maneuvering core-size units, which are very, very large, over the European landmass, we're a lot out of practice with that. I mean, the Americans and to a certain extent the British, we've done it in the desert, but actually taking a long line of communication over Western landmass with undeveloped roads through close country is a complex undertaking, and the Russians simply do not have the expertise or the ability to maintain that at the standard that maybe some analysts think they should. And so it's really no surprise that a lot of it is ground down. But they will regroup, and they will work an echelon system, and they will make it work.
Vincent, did you want to make a point about logistics there? I think James was saying that distribution of weapons was a little bit held up.
Yeah, I agree with what James has to say there. The underlying systems to be able to get equipment into the hands that it's needed, especially in a combat zone, is at first glance it's far more complicated than it might appear at first glance, because not only do you have to think about very tactical decisions like what roads to take, what routes to take, but you also have to plan the protection of those convoys that are going to be transporting the material by ground forces. And this can include adding additional elements like mounted infantry or gun trucks, or it can also include trying to provide some sort of Stinger teams to be able to provide protection from possible aerial attacks. So the plan for getting those goods distributed throughout the country to the Ukrainian fighters to the points where they're needed requires a lot of careful planning and very detailed military intelligence about the situation on the ground in order to get it done correctly.
Justin Bronk, James mentioned a moment ago tactical nuclear weapons. I'm reading more and more articles suggesting that there are rumblings in the Kremlin in Moscow that they may use tactical nuclear weapons. First of all, what are they? Are they limited? And, what is the chance that Russia would resort to such a thing?
Well, I mean, there's a debate among nuclear scholars about whether there is such a thing as a tactical nuclear weapon or a non-strategic nuclear weapon. Certainly any nuclear use would have strategic consequences, but fundamentally these are weapons with a relatively low yield in the kiloton range, so roughly sort of between about 10 times smaller than Hiroshima, so about a kiloton, or up to several times more than that. Typically, the discussions around the Russian tactical nuclear use would be to try and force a change in the narrative to force, in this case, Kiev to back down. It's worth remembering that even a tactical nuclear weapon is not going to do more than destroy, things in around a mile or a mile and a bit radius and create a load of radiation, which incidentally would be a problem in terms of the fallout, would potentially be a problem for Russian territory as well. Fundamentally, Russia, I can't actually envisage easily a scenario wherein the Kremlin's leadership chain manages to actually transmit an order to use tactical nuclear weapons sort of unprovoked against Ukraine itself. Because fundamentally, A, this is a non-nuclear power, B, it's a massively smaller nuclear power that is considered in very deep, in a very deep sense, inferior to Russia in every sense within the Russian political and cultural mindset. There's no way that they could possibly constrain or construe Ukraine as a strategic threat to Russia. So using a tactical nuclear weapon as a first use against that sort of power, I think, would be difficult. Even within the system. Of course, it's impossible to know. That would change immediately if there was any direct contact with Western NATO forces, because the Russian military is actually very overstretched in Ukraine. They've committed about 75% of their usable ground power without national mobilization. It's not going well. They've taken extremely heavy losses. And so if there was any direct contact with Western forces, there would be a very short escalation ladder between that and more widespread conventional conflict with NATO, which the Russian army simply doesn't have a conventional response to right now. So as a result, if there was direct contact with Western forces, they would have suddenly strong incentives to move to a tactical nuclear use in order to try and force the West to back down immediately.
Justin, the point's been made in various journals that Russia has failed to achieve air superiority over Ukraine. Why do you think that is?
So I think there's a couple of components, but first and foremost, Russia has an advantage in a very large cruise and ballistic missile arsenal, but those are only capable of striking fixed targets or targets that have real-time surveillance over them. So they wiped out a lot of Ukraine's long-range air defenses in the first couple of hours, but the Russians basically don't have a credible suppression of enemy air defenses capability, which is really, even in NATO, something that only the US currently possesses. And so they haven't been able to hunt down Ukrainian medium and short-range mobile surface-to-air missile systems. They've been able to sort of inflict some attrition over time, but fundamentally that means that Russian aircraft are at serious risk and serious danger from those SAM systems, things like SA-8 or SA-11, at medium altitude and above, anything more than a few kilometers in from their own airspace. What that has meant is that they have had to fly very low, where manpads like Stinger and Starstreak are effective, or fly at night, also generally very low. And they also don't have a very large number of precision-guided munitions and have even fewer pilots who are capable of using them effectively. So what this means is they want to achieve battlefield effect with, let's say, fast jets. They have about 350 modern fast jets. They have to basically deliver unguided bombs or rockets at relatively low level, which makes them very vulnerable. So fundamentally, Russia tried to massively up its operational tempo between the 2nd and the 6th of March. They lost about 11 fast jets in those 3 days. and then they have switched to a much lower tempo of operations with predominantly standoff fighters and nighttime low-level strike ops.
Liam Collins, we're coming towards the end of the program. Let's just start looking towards the future and trying to predict what's going to happen here. How do you see the conflict developing?
I mean, I think it's going to move to the east where he can try to salvage some kind of victory that he can sell to his Russian population. But it's going to drag on for months or years. Russia can sustain for extended period of time, even if they scale back that conflict. So I think you're going to see it drag on in the east and kind of the battle play out between the superior force at the tactical level against a nation with overwhelming combat power.
Liam Collins, James Maclaren, Vincent Castillo, and Justin Bronk, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week, then, goodbye.